Hello. So we're going to show how the debug trace window in Sonoa Systems Control Center can be used to debug web services, figure out when they're working, when they're not working, and to debug problems either with the service themselves or with Sonoa. So what I'm going to do is I've already launched this debug trace window from Control Center in our ServiceNet product. And I'm just going to launch the debug window, which is now waiting for me to send a message. I'm not going to show the actual web service I'm calling, but essentially what it does is it's a web service that sits in front of a website, does some very simple AJAX-style web services in order to do some mapping stuff. So I just went over to my other window, and I sent, as you can see, 8 web services requests. I can now go into the debug window, and I can see, for instance, what was sent by the client and what was received back on the client. So this shows me what happened from the client to ServiceNet over here, and then what was sent back. Over on the right, I can also click. I can select a different message, for instance. And I can also click over here, and I can see what was sent from ServiceNet to my backend server and the response that came back. So you can actually see, did I get an error back from the server, or was the error actually introduced somewhere else? I can also see, in all these steps here, what happened to all the various steps in the processing request that ServiceNet did. So for instance, I can see here that I did authentication, and I can see what header was used to figure out authentication, and I can even see what parameters I used, in this case to query LDAP. But there are a lot of different things that I could have done here, and I can see other things. I can see, for instance, in my response time, I added a policy to add an expiration header, and I can see what variable I added. I requested in order to do that. I can see what header I added, and now when I go back and see the response, I can actually see that that header should be back on the client response here. There it is. There's my expires header. The other fun thing about this is I can now use this as well to figure out when things go wrong. So for instance, I just sent a request that had an invalid username. I should see on here, here's the request, the username was invalid, and here's the ServiceNet, the error message that ServiceNet sent back. We sent back a 401 error. I can now click here on the client request, the authentication policy, and I can see what happened. Well, there's the username, there's the invalid password. Well, that's why authentication failed. Similarly, there are other things we can do as well. So for instance, same goes with rate limiting. So I have a particular user ID that only has a rate limit of a couple of requests a second. I just sent some requests, and the very last request here, we should actually have received, again, a error in the rate limiting. Your service limit has been exceeded. And again, debug console shows me here, I see an error message right here in the rate limiting policy. And this will now actually show me the rate limiting policy failed. Here's the error message that was returned, the fault limit. And here are some of the parameters that were used to figure out what the rate limit should be. And that's really all that there is to it. This is a very interesting tool because it allows you to see not only what's going on in a successful service request, but also what goes on in a service request that failed. And part of the fun, of course, is that you might have to do this in production. So we allow you not only to filter your debugging by what service you want to look at, but you can also filter by IP address. So for instance, if you know how to reproduce a problem with your service, you can even turn this on your production service. It will have no overhead except for requests coming from the IP address you specify. And you can then see only the requests coming from there. So you can send a request from a test client or whatever you need to do to diagnose a problem. And with that said, that's it.